Thanks for staying with us on Midday, Kentucky. All right, we are talking bourbon because we know that is kind of everybody's favorite. It's that time. The Kentucky Black Bourbon Guild honors minority involvement throughout bourbon history. They also embrace the future development through community building and education. Gathan's here to tell us more. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Yeah, glad to be here.
You have a really hard topic to talk about all the time, don't you?
Yeah, you know, everybody likes bourbon. I think being in Kentucky, you know, 95% of the bourbon is made here in Kentucky, so you know, it's part of our blood and part of who we are.
Well, we were talking about it yesterday on the news, the economic impact of bourbon in the state, and it's phenomenal. It's through the roof.
Yeah, the Kentucky Distillers Association released a report, so bourbon tourism and bourbon industry as a whole has doubled. In 10 years, last 10 years, it's doubled in its economic impact throughout the state. And so you're seeing it through all communities like Louisville, like Bardstown, and especially right here in Lexington, Kentucky.
That's incredible.
Now, and you know, it's even affected all these small towns. So I want to know how this started, though. How did you all really, you know, what was the point? Like, how did it start going? Because it's awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things. Like, I think a lot of times as African Americans, we're always consumers of bourbon, but there hasn't been a group that's spoken directly to us as a consumer. And so our president, Rob Beatty, actually took a tour this past summer and took some friends down to a distillery down in Bardstown. And then he came back and he actually came to my office, and he and I were just talking about, you know, how do we get more African Americans interested in bourbon? And so then we started talking about some things that we could do to help create an organization that would also educate African Americans about bourbon, introduce them to bourbon, but also do some type of community development to where we have a stake in the community to help grow minorities' involvement in the bourbon industry going forward. And so that's kind of where it came from this past summer.
It's definitely a win-win situation for everybody involved. Yeah. Well, tell us about your members. Are most of them already in the bourbon industry? Are they new? Are they willing to learn?
Our membership is really interesting. We get a lot of new members that we've got in there. Now, what we found out is, you know, about 60% of our members are all women. And so at our initial launch event that we had Freddie Johnson from Buffalo Trace. And when you came in and saw the room of people at our launch event, you know, more than half of that room was all women. And that just goes to just the industry as a whole, because women have been the fastest growing segment of bourbon drinkers across the board. Wow. And so it falls in line with that. And so for us, a lot of our members, we've got bourbon enthusiasts, we've got people who are newcomers, so it's a really good mix of both. But the one thing that stands out is a majority of them are women.
That's interesting.
Now, Gathan, you guys have a lot of events coming up. Can you kind of tell us about some of those?
Yeah, so we've done, what we try to do as part of our membership, we try to honor 2 events a month. So every first Saturday, we do an educational workshop. It's at Base 110. Tim Niddle, who's the executive bourbon steward at the Kentucky Castle, does an education workshop, and it's a 2-hour workshop, 10 a.m. to 12 noon. So that's guaranteed every single month. Wow. And then we also do like another tasting event throughout the rest of the month. So this past month we did a wild turkey blind tasting at Bell's Cocktail House. And so right now we're working on an event that we're going to try to do at the end of February to honor Black History Month and try to do another tasting event. And so the idea is to have one educational event, one tasting event, and then quarterly we'll do a distillery tour at one of the distilleries throughout the state, and we'll do that quarterly for our membership.
That's fantastic. You're very, very active in the community.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about minorities and their history in the bourbon industry.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, you know, the minority involvement in bourbon goes all the way back to pre-prohibition. You know, and you're talking about former slaves who were actually mixologists and bartenders back then, but because of slave laws and things of that nature, their history has been wiped out. So now we're starting to find out a lot of information about African Americans and their contribution. A new name that a lot of people are hearing in the whiskey industry as a whole is Nearest Green, who taught Jack Daniels how to distill whiskey.
But there's also,
and there's also people like Tom Bullock, who was the first African American to write a cocktail book. There's another gentleman by the name of Cato Alexander, who was a former slave, who actually is credited with being the king of the julep when the mint julep hit New York.
Wow.
And so there were a lot of free blacks that owned saloons and other bars in like New Orleans and DC back then, but then present day, you talk about guys like Freddie Johnson from Buffalo Trace, who's a 3rd-generation distillery worker at Buffalo Trace. If anybody's ever gone to Buffalo Trace and had a tour with Freddie, he's like your grandfather. Everybody knows who he is. So you're talking about people like him. And so now what we hope to do with our group is to try to figure out where can we help find the next Freddie Johnson to get minorities involved into the F&B side of the business there.
It's fantastic you're bringing all of this light, and you let us right into, if somebody is interested in joining your group, how do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, the best way to find us, you know, we've got a website at www.KentuckyBlackBourbonGuild.com, but you can also find us on Facebook as well. We're responding to a lot of messages that way, but you can find us across all those social channels as well. So Kentucky Bourbon Black Guild is where you'll find us at.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here,
No,
Gathan.
glad to
Thank
be
you
here.
for all you do. It's important to bring all this light
Yeah.
We may be joining some of those meetings.
We love to have you out.
Yes.
We love to have you.
You can always learn a little bit more about bourbon.
Totally.
Right?
Totally.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stay with us.